The Philadelphia winter pressed against my window that Tuesday morning, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes you grateful for the warmth inside. I was 73 years old, and my routine had become as predictable as the seasons. Wake at 6, coffee by 7, crossword puzzle until 9. My apartment on Chestnut Street wasn't much, but it was mine, paid for with 40 years of work at the textile factory before my retirement. My name is Deirdre Calloway, and I'd lived my entire life believing that family was everything. I raised 3 children after my husband Thomas died of a heart attack when I was 42. Garrett, my oldest at 51, had always been ambitious, perhaps too much so. Lenora, 48, was the one I thought would always stand by me, my only daughter, my confidant. And Maxwell, 45, my baby, who'd struggled with purpose his entire adult life. The phone rang at 9:47. I remember the exact time because I was filling in 17 across when the sound interrupted my concentration. It was Christine Yardley from First Liberty Bank, her voice carrying that professional warmth that banking representatives perfect over years of customer service. We'd spoken before, brief exchanges about statements or minor account questions. But this call was different. Christine's tone shifted after the pleasantries, becoming more cautious, almost protective. She told me there had been multiple attempts to access my savings account over the past week. Not small withdrawals, but requests to move substantial sums. Nearly everything I had. My heart began its uncomfortable rhythm, that flutter that had become more common since my last cardiology appointment. The requests, Christine explained, had come with documentation claiming urgent medical necessity. Someone was trying to authorize transfers for my care and treatment, complete with forged signatures that almost matched mine. Almost. The bank's fraud detection system had flagged the inconsistencies. The signatures were good, she admitted, but not perfect. And the IP addresses from which the requests originated were scattered across 3 different states, none of them Pennsylvania. I felt the room tilt slightly. My hands, weathered from decades of factory work, gripped the phone tighter. I asked Christine the question that was burning in my throat, though part of me already knew the answer. Who had submitted these requests? There was a pause, the kind that stretches for an eternity in a single second. Then Christine told me what I both expected and desperately hoped wasn't true. The requests had come from email addresses registered to Garrett Calloway, Lenora Pritchard, her married name, and Maxwell Calloway, my children, all 3 of them. I thanked Christine with a voice that didn't sound like my own, assured her I would come to the bank immediately, and ended the call. Then I sat in my chair, the crossword puzzle forgotten, staring at the winter light filtering through my curtains. The apartment suddenly felt different, as if the walls themselves had witnessed a betrayal they couldn't quite process. Pictures of my children lined the mantel above the decorative fireplace. Garrett's law school graduation, Lenora's wedding, where I'd sewn her veil by hand, Maxwell holding his first daughter when she was born. I had given them everything. After Thomas died, I worked double shifts when the factory allowed it. I skipped meals so they could have new school clothes. I took out loans for their educations. Loans I'd only finished paying off 5 years ago. When Garrett's first business failed, I'd given him $15,000 from my savings. When Lenora's marriage hit rocky ground and she needed therapy, I'd helped with those costs too. When Maxwell couldn't make rent, my door was always open. And now they were trying to steal from me. Not borrow, not ask, steal. The word felt obscene in my mind, but there was no other way to frame it. They weren't concerned about my medical care. I wasn't sick, not seriously. My diabetes was managed, my blood pressure controlled with medication. This wasn't about helping me. This was about taking what I had before I could spend it, or perhaps before I died, and they'd have to wait for their inheritance. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I stood up, my knees protesting slightly, and walked to the kitchen. I poured myself a glass of water with hands that trembled just enough to notice. Outside, the city continued its indifferent rhythm. Cars honked on the street below. A siren wailed in the distance. Life moved forward, uncaring about the small domestic catastrophe unfolding in apartment 4C. I had always told my children that family was sacred, that blood meant something more than just genetics. It meant loyalty, trust, protection. I'd believed it with every fiber of my being, had structured my entire life around that principle. But standing in my kitchen that Tuesday morning, I realized that perhaps I'd been teaching a lesson my children had never learned. Or worse, that they'd learned it and simply didn't care. I set down the water glass and reached for my coat. The bank was 6 blocks away, and I needed to see those documents for myself. I needed to hear the recordings, if there were any. I needed to understand how deep this betrayal went, because if there's one thing 40 years in a textile factory teaches you, it's that you need to see the full pattern before you can understand what's being woven. Chapter 2. The Evidence. The walk to First Liberty Bank felt longer than 6 blocks. Every step through the Philadelphia cold seemed to carry the weight of 31 years of single motherhood. Every sacrifice made, every dream deferred. The city around me buzzed with its usual energy. Professionals in wool coats hurrying to meetings, delivery trucks double-parked, the distant rumble of the Market Frankfurt line beneath the streets. None of them knew that my world had just fractured. Christine Yardley met me in a private office, her expression sympathetic in that way people look at you when they know something terrible that you're just beginning to comprehend. She was perhaps 40, with kind eyes behind practical glasses, and she'd brought a folder thick with documents. She spread them across the desk between us with careful hands, pointing out the inconsistencies that had saved my life savings. The signatures were indeed remarkably close to mine, the same flowing D, the particular way I crossed my L's. Someone had practiced, had studied my handwriting with dedication, but there were tells, Christine explained. The pressure points were wrong in several places. The angle of certain letters didn't quite match, and most damning, the medical documentation attached to the requests referenced conditions I didn't have and treatments I didn't need. One document claimed I required immediate cardiac surgery, costing $87,000. Another referenced advanced dementia care. A third detailed a fall I'd supposedly suffered, resulting in hip replacement surgery that was urgently needed. None of it was true. Christine then did something I hadn't expected. She played me the phone calls. The bank had recorded the verbal authorization attempts that had accompanied the paperwork. She warned me it might be difficult to hear, then pressed play on her computer. The first voice was Garrett's, smooth and professional as always. He was speaking to a different bank representative, explaining that his mother, Deirdre Calloway, was in declining health and needed immediate access to her funds for medical care. His tone was perfect, concerned but not panicked, authoritative without being aggressive. It was the voice he used in his legal practice, the one that convinced judges and juries. He was lying with the same skill he used to defend his clients. The second recording featured Lenora. My daughter's voice cracked with what sounded like genuine emotion as she explained that I'd fallen, that I was confused, that I couldn't manage my own affairs anymore. She referenced specific dates, created a narrative so detailed it almost sounded real. She even mentioned my diabetes, using my actual medical history to lend credibility to her fiction. She was crying as she lied about me. Maxwell's recording was shorter, less polished. He sounded nervous, which almost made it worse because his anxiety seemed to come not from guilt but from fear of getting caught. He stammered through his explanation, eventually just saying he needed the money released for my care facility placement. All 3 of my children, in their separate calls, painting a picture of a woman who didn't exist, confused, failing, in need of institutional care. They were trying to have me declared incompetent without my knowledge, to take control of funds I'd earned through decades of labor. I sat in that office, listening to my children's voices weave their lies, and something inside me that had been cracking finally broke clean through. The tears came then, hot and bitter, and Christine quietly pushed a box of tissues across the desk. She gave me time to compose myself before continuing. There was more, she said gently. The investigation had revealed that this wasn't spontaneous. The emails coordinating these attempts dated back 3 months. They'd been planning this, discussing it, dividing up responsibilities. Garrett had handled the legal-sounding documentation. Lenora had crafted the emotional narrative. Maxwell had been tasked with finding a care facility that would accept the placement and presumably provide kickbacks. They'd formed a conspiracy against me, their mother. Christine explained what I needed to do next. We would flag the account immediately, freeze any attempted transfers, place additional security measures that would require my physical presence for any changes. She recommended I speak with the bank's legal department, and perhaps the police. The police. The word hung in the air between us like something toxic. I was going to have to report my own children for attempted fraud. I signed the necessary documents with a hand that had steadied itself through sheer force of will. 40 years of factory work had taught me that sometimes you have to keep moving, even when everything in you wants to stop, to give up, to pretend this wasn't happening. Christine walked me to the door, squeezed my shoulder gently, and told me she was sorry. I believed her, but her sympathy couldn't change what I now knew. The 3 people I'd loved most in the world, the ones I'd sacrificed everything for, had seen me as nothing more than an inconvenient obstacle to money they felt entitled to. I walked out of that bank into the Philadelphia afternoon with my financial assets protected, but something far more valuable utterly destroyed. Trust, once broken this completely, doesn't heal. It doesn't even leave a scar because scars form over wounds that close. This wound would stay open. I had one stop to make before going home. 3 blocks from the bank was a small electronics shop where I'd once bought a replacement phone. The owner, a young man named Omar who'd always been patient with my questions about technology, helped me purchase a new phone with a new number. I didn't want my children to reach me. Not yet. Not until I'd decided what came next. As I walked back to my apartment, the winter sun already beginning its early descent, I made a decision. I would not be a victim in this story. I would not play the part of the confused, declining old woman they'd tried to create. I was Deirdre Calloway. I'd survived widowhood at 42, raised 3 children alone, worked until my hands ached and my back screamed, and built a life from nothing but determination and love. If they wanted a fight, they'd get one, but it wouldn't be the fight they expected. Because the thing about being underestimated your entire life is that you learn to use it as a weapon. Chapter 3. The Messages. I spent that evening in my apartment organizing my thoughts and my evidence. Years of factory work had trained me to be methodical, to approach problems systematically. If you rushed on the textile line, you made mistakes. Mistakes cost time and money. I wouldn't make mistakes now. My new phone sat on the kitchen table, a barrier between my old life and whatever came next. My old phone continued to buzz and chime with increasing frequency. I'd turned off the sound, but left it on, watching the screen light up with incoming messages and calls. First came Garrett's call at 6:15, exactly when he typically finished at his law office. When I didn't answer, he left a voicemail. I played it on speaker, needing to hear what he would say now that the bank had surely notified them of the failed transfers. His voice was measured, professional, concerned. "Mom, it's Garrett. I heard there was some confusion at the bank today. Give me a call when you get this. We need to discuss your accounts and make sure everything is properly managed. You know I'm always here to help with these complicated financial matters. Complicated financial matters. As if I were too simple to understand my own savings account." Lenora's text came at 6:43. "Mom, why aren't you answering? We're worried. Garrett said something happened at the bank. Please call me back. I love you." The "I love you" at the end felt like a particular cruelty. Maxwell's message was more direct, arriving at 7:12. "Mom, what's going on? The bank called me asking questions. Did you change something? Call me." I sat at my kitchen table, watching these messages accumulate, each one a tiny detonation of the life I'd known. They were coordinating, obviously. Probably in a group chat I wasn't part of, discussing how to handle me, how to present a united front of concern and confusion. They thought they could manipulate me, that decades of maternal love would override what I now knew to be true. They believed I would doubt myself, question whether maybe I really was confused, whether maybe they really were just trying to help. But I'd heard the recordings. I'd seen the forged signatures. I knew exactly what they'd tried to do. At 8 o'clock, I finally picked up my old phone and typed a response in our family group chat, the one where we'd shared holiday plans and birthday wishes and photos of grandchildren. My fingers moved slowly over the screen, each word chosen with care. "I know what you tried to do. I have the recordings from the bank. I have the forged documents. I have signed a fraud alert with First Liberty, and the police have been notified. Do not contact me again. Do not come to my home. Any further communication will be documented and provided to law enforcement." I attached a photo of the police report I'd filed that afternoon. Detective Marcus Howell of the Philadelphia Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit had been patient with me, explaining the process, assuring me I'd done the right thing by reporting it immediately. I sent the message and watched the 3 dots appear almost instantly, indicating someone was typing. Then they stopped. Then they appeared again. This happened several times over the next few minutes as they presumably scrambled, arguing amongst themselves about how to respond. Finally, Lenora's message came through. "Mom, this is all a misunderstanding. We were trying to help. You're not well. We're scared for you. Please, let's talk about this face to face." Even now, she was lying, claiming I wasn't well, using concern as a weapon. Garrett's message was more calculated. "Mother, I strongly advise you to reconsider this action. You're potentially creating legal complications that could be harmful to the family. We can resolve this privately. There's no need to involve authorities in a family matter." Translation: "We might get in trouble, so please protect us by staying silent." Maxwell's response was pure panic. "Mom, I'm sorry I didn't want to do this. They said you wouldn't mind. They said you had too much money anyway. Please don't do this. I can't go to jail. I have kids." At least Maxwell's fear was honest, even if nothing else about him had been. I didn't respond. I simply muted the chat and set the phone aside. Let them panic. Let them face consequences. Let them feel a fraction of the betrayal I was drowning in. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my bed, the same bed where Thomas had died 31 years ago, and stared at the ceiling. The heating system clicked and hummed. Outside, Philadelphia's nighttime symphony played its familiar tune, distant sirens, the occasional shout, the rumble of late-night traffic. I thought about all the times I'd comforted these children when they were young, Garrett's night terrors after his father died, how I'd held him until dawn broke, Lenora's heartbreak over her first boyfriend, how we'd eaten ice cream and watched movies until she smiled again, Maxwell's struggles in school, how I'd sat with him for hours helping with homework, celebrating every small victory. I'd loved them with everything I had. I'd believed that love was enough, that it would create a foundation of mutual respect and care that would last our entire lives. But somewhere along the way, between childhood and middle age, my children had learned to see me not as a person, but as a resource. Not as their mother, but as an inconvenience standing between them, and an inheritance they apparently felt they'd already earned simply by being born. The tears came again, quieter this time, more about grief than shock. I was mourning the children I thought I'd raised, the family I thought we'd built. Those people, if they'd ever truly existed, were gone. In their place were 3 middle-aged strangers who'd tried to steal from me. Around 3 a.m, I got up and made tea. I sat at my kitchen table and began writing. Not a letter to them, nothing they'd ever see, but a record for myself. I wrote down every sacrifice I remembered making, every time I'd chosen their needs over mine, every dream I'd deferred so they could have opportunities I'd never had. The list grew long. It took 17 pages in my neat handwriting, the same handwriting they'd tried to forge. When I finished, as dawn began to lighten the Philadelphia sky, I felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness, certainly not that, but a kind of clarity. I'd done everything a mother could do. Their betrayal wasn't a failure of my love, but a failure of their character. I couldn't control who they'd become. But I could control what happened next. Chapter 4. The Investigation. Detective Howell called me 3 days later. His voice on the phone was professional but kind, the way good police officers learn to sound when dealing with elderly victims. I bristled slightly at being categorized that way, even though technically that's exactly what I was. He needed me to come to the station to provide additional information. The Financial Crimes Unit had begun their investigation, and there were details that required clarification. I agreed, noting the appointment in the small calendar I kept by my phone, the same kind of paper calendar I'd used for 40 years. The 9th District Station was a hulking concrete building on Race Street that had always seemed vaguely threatening when I'd passed it on buses. Inside, it was bureaucratic and fluorescent, filled with the sounds of ringing phones and clacking keyboards. Detective Howell met me in the lobby, a tall black man in his early 50s with graying temples and tired eyes that had seen too much of humanity's capacity for cruelty. He led me to an interview room that was small and sterile, offering me coffee that I declined. My hands were already shaking enough without adding caffeine. The detective laid out what they'd found so far. My children's attempts had been extensive and sophisticated. They'd created a network of false documentation spanning multiple institutions. Garrett, using his legal knowledge, had drafted convincing medical directives and power of attorney documents, all bearing my forged signature. Lenora had contacted several assisted living facilities, inquiring about memory care for her mother and discussing payment structures. Maxwell had actually opened a separate bank account in my name at a different institution, presumably to funnel the money once they successfully transferred it. This hadn't been a desperate, spontaneous act. This had been a conspiracy months in the making. Detective Howell watched my face as he explained all this, his expression gentle but alert. He was probably worried I'd break down, that the weight of it would be too much. But I'd cried myself dry over the past 3 days. Now I just felt cold, analytical, determined. I asked him what would happen next. He explained the process. The district attorney would review the evidence and decide whether to file charges. Given the amount of money involved, nearly $300,000, and the sophistication of the scheme, criminal charges were likely. I would need to be willing to testify if the case went to trial. "These are your children," he said carefully. "I need to make sure you understand what you're asking for. Criminal fraud charges could mean prison time. Are you prepared for that outcome?" I met his eyes steadily. "Detective, they were prepared to render me homeless and destitute by stealing everything I have. They were prepared to have me declared incompetent and institutionalized. I think I can be prepared to let them face the consequences of their actions." He nodded slowly, something like respect flickering in his tired eyes. He'd probably seen too many victims, especially elderly ones, back down when facing the reality of prosecuting family members. Over the next week, the investigation expanded. Detective Howell called me with updates that painted an increasingly damning picture. They'd found email chains where my children discussed my finances, referring to my savings as the inheritance, as if I were already dead. They'd speculated about my life expectancy, about whether I was spending too much, about how to secure the assets before she wastes it all. Wastes it. On what? My rent was modest. I lived frugally, a habit from decades of necessary parsimony that had never left me. The money sat in my account, slowly growing through modest interest, intended for my final years, and perhaps something left over for grandchildren's educations. But they couldn't wait, or wouldn't wait. To them, I was simply taking too long to die. Lenora's phone records showed multiple calls to nursing homes and elder care attorneys. She'd been researching how to have someone declared mentally incompetent in Pennsylvania, what documentation was required, how long the process typically took. She'd taken notes, created a plan, treated my autonomy as nothing more than a legal obstacle to overcome. Garrett's law firm computer had search histories about elder financial abuse, specifically researching ways to avoid detection. He'd been covering his tracks, or trying to, learning from cases where others had been caught. His legal training, which I'd helped pay for, was being used to victimize me more effectively. Maxwell's role was simpler, but no less cruel. He'd been the front man, the one who would physically move me into a facility once they'd secured conservatorship. He'd toured 3 different memory care units, discussed pricing, asked about policies for residents who resisted their placement. They'd thought of everything, except the possibility that I might find out before they succeeded. During this time, my phone continued to receive messages from them, though less frequently as the days passed. The tone shifted from fake concern to anger to desperate pleading. Garrett sent a long text explaining that he'd only been trying to protect my assets from bad decisions. Lenora called repeatedly, leaving voicemails where she cried and insisted she loved me, that this was all a misunderstanding. Maxwell's messages became increasingly panicked as he apparently learned that criminal investigations had consequences. I didn't respond to any of them. I'd said everything I needed to say in that first message. The police report was my final word on the subject. My days took on a strange rhythm. I still did my crossword puzzles, still made my meals, still walked to the corner store for groceries. But everything felt different, filtered through the knowledge of what had almost happened. I found myself looking at other elderly people on the street, wondering how many of them were being victimized by their own families, how many had children who saw them as inconvenient obstacles rather than human beings deserving of dignity. The hardest part wasn't the betrayal itself, but the collateral damage. My grandchildren, Garrett's 2 boys, Lenora's daughter, Maxwell's 3 kids, were innocent in all this, but I couldn't separate them from their parents' actions. How could I see them now without seeing what their parents had tried to do? How could I play the role of doting grandmother while prosecuting their parents? The answer was simple and brutal. I couldn't. Those relationships were casualties of their parents. Greed. One evening, about 2 weeks after the initial discovery, I received an unexpected visit. My apartment buzzer rang at 7:30. Through the intercom, a woman's voice identified herself as Patricia Greenfield, my daughter-in-law, married to Garrett. I hesitated, then buzzed her up. Patricia had always been distant with me, polite but cool, never quite welcoming me into her and Garrett's life. I'd attributed it to class differences. Her family had money, mine didn't. But perhaps there had been more to it. She stood in my doorway looking expensive and uncomfortable, wearing a camel hair coat that probably cost more than my monthly rent. She asked if she could come in. I let her, curious about what had brought her here. Patricia didn't sit down. She stood in my living room, her designer handbag clutched against her body like a shield, and told me something I hadn't expected. She'd known about the plan. Garrett had discussed it with her, and she'd told him not to do it, that it was wrong, that it would destroy our family. He'd done it anyway. Now she was here to tell me that she was leaving him. She was taking their sons and filing for divorce. She said she couldn't be married to someone capable of what Garrett had tried to do, that she'd realized she didn't actually know the man she'd been married to for 24 years. I stared at her, this woman who'd never particularly liked me, who was now making a choice based on principle that her own husband hadn't been able to make. "I'm sorry," Patricia said, her voice tight. "I'm sorry I didn't stop him. I'm sorry I didn't warn you. I thought he'd come to his senses. I was wrong." She left her contact information, said I could reach out if I ever wanted a relationship with my grandsons, that she wouldn't keep them from me even though their father was facing criminal charges. After she left, I sat in my chair for a long time, processing this unexpected development. The family was fracturing in ways I hadn't anticipated. Garrett hadn't just betrayed me. He'd destroyed his own marriage. His greed had cost him everything. I felt no satisfaction in this, only a deep, bone-weary sadness at the wreckage spreading out from their actions like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. Chapter 5. The Arraignment. 3 months after the initial discovery, the district attorney's office filed formal charges: 3 counts of conspiracy to commit fraud, multiple counts of forgery, and attempted financial exploitation of an elderly person. The last charge carried enhanced penalties under Pennsylvania law, designed specifically to protect people like me from people like my children. I received notification that an arraignment was scheduled for mid-April. I wasn't required to attend, but I wanted to be there. I needed to see them, to look them in the eyes, and show them I wasn't backing down. The courtroom was in the Criminal Justice Center on Filbert Street, a modern building that still managed to feel oppressive with its security checkpoints and stern-faced guards. Detective Howell met me outside the courtroom, having offered to accompany me through the process. Inside, the room was smaller than I'd expected. Nothing like the dramatic courtrooms on television. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The judge's bench dominated the space. Everything was wood-paneled and official-looking, designed to project authority. My children sat at the defense table with their lawyers. They'd each retained separate counsel, which itself was telling. They couldn't even trust each other enough to coordinate their defense. When I walked in, all 3 of them turned to look at me. Garrett's expression was hard, angry, as if I were the one who'd committed a crime against him. Lenora's face crumpled, tears already streaming, playing the victim even here. Maxwell looked terrified, his skin pale, his hands trembling visibly on the table. I took my seat in the gallery, keeping my spine straight and my expression neutral. I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. The arraignment itself was brief and procedural. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s named Sandra Kowalski, read the charges in a voice that had pronounced too many crimes to carry much emotion. She asked each defendant how they pleaded. Garrett's lawyer, a sharp-dressed man with silver hair, entered a plea of not guilty. Lenora's lawyer did the same. Maxwell's public defender, younger and less polished than the others, followed suit. Not guilty, despite the evidence, the recordings, the paper trail. They were still lying, still pretending they'd done nothing wrong. Judge Kowalski set bail amounts and conditions. They were not to contact me in any way. They were not to leave the state. Their passports were to be surrendered to the court. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 8 weeks out. As the proceedings ended, I stood to leave. That's when Lenora broke free from her lawyer's restraining hand and called out across the courtroom, "Mom, please, we're your children. How can you do this to us?" I stopped walking, turned to face her. For the first time in 3 months, I spoke directly to one of them. "You stopped being my children the day you tried to rob me," I said, my voice carrying clearly in the quiet courtroom. "Now you're just 3 people facing the consequences of their choices." Judge Kowalski's gavel came down. "Order in the court. Ms. Pritchard, return to your seat immediately or you'll be held in contempt." I walked out of that courtroom with my head high, though my legs trembled beneath me. Detective Howell walked beside me, his presence steady and reassuring. Outside, spring sunshine was breaking through Philadelphia's perpetual clouds. The city smelled of car exhaust and street vendor pretzels, familiar and grounding. I stood on the courthouse steps, breathing deeply, feeling something inside me settle into a new configuration. This wasn't over. There would be a preliminary hearing, possibly a trial, months or years of legal proceedings. But I'd crossed a threshold. I'd stood in front of my children and held firm to the truth. They'd tried to destroy me, and I wouldn't protect them from themselves. The following weeks brought their own challenges. Word spread through my social circles, church, the retired factory workers, lunch group, my neighbors. People didn't quite know how to react. Some were supportive, telling me I'd done the right thing, that family or not. What my children had attempted was criminal. Others were uncomfortable, changing the subject when legal matters came up, clearly thinking I should have handled it privately. But the most difficult responses came from people who suggested I should forgive them, that family was everything, that surely we could work this out without involving the courts. These people didn't understand, couldn't understand, that forgiveness wasn't the issue. Justice was the issue. Protecting myself was the issue. Sending a message that I was a person deserving of dignity was the issue. I spent my evenings writing in a journal Detective Howell had suggested I keep, documenting everything for potential trial testimony. I wrote about the factory years, the sacrifices, the love I'd poured into raising them. I wrote about the shock of discovery, the pain of betrayal, the determination to stand firm despite the cost. And there was a cost. The loneliness was profound. I'd lost not just my children, but the social identity of being a mother, a grandmother. People asked about my family at church, and I had to decide each time whether to explain or deflect. Usually I deflected. The full story was too raw, too complicated, too likely to invite judgment I wasn't prepared to handle. One evening in May, as Philadelphia's humidity began its annual assault on the city, I received a letter, not from my children, but from an unexpected source. A woman named Iris Delacroix, who identified herself as a member of a support group for elderly financial abuse victims. She'd read about my case in the local news. She wanted me to know I wasn't alone, that there were others who'd experienced similar betrayals. She invited me to a meeting. I almost threw the letter away. The idea of sitting in a circle with strangers, discussing the worst moment of my life, held no appeal. But something in Iris's words caught my attention. She'd written, "The shame isn't ours to carry. The shame belongs to the ones who tried to take from us. But we carry it anyway, until we learn to set it down." That night, I decided I'd go to at least one meeting. Not because I wanted to share my story, but because I needed to stop feeling so utterly alone in what I was experiencing. The support group met in a church basement in Germantown, a neighborhood north of Center City. 12 folding chairs arranged in a circle, coffee brewing in the corner, institutional carpet that had seen better decades. 7 people attended that first meeting I went to, ranging in age from early 60s to late 80s. Iris facilitated with gentle competence. We didn't have to share if we didn't want to. Just listening was enough. But people talked, their stories spilling out like water from a broken dam. A woman named Eleanor described how her son had stolen her medications and sold them, leaving her in pain and withdrawal. A man named Walter talked about his daughter draining his account through unauthorized debit card charges over 5 years. A woman named Ruth had been evicted from her own home by her granddaughter, who'd forged a deed transfer. Each story was unique in its details, but identical in its core. People they loved had treated them not as human beings, but as resources to exploit. When it came to my turn, I found myself speaking. The words came slowly at first, then faster, the whole story pouring out. The bank call, the recordings, the police report, the arraignment, the isolation I now lived with. When I finished, the room was silent for a moment. Then Iris spoke. "You did something most people in this room couldn't do. You reported them. You're holding them accountable. That takes tremendous courage." "It doesn't feel like courage," I said quietly. "It feels like survival." "Sometimes," Iris replied. "Those are the same thing." I kept attending the meetings, not every week, but regularly enough that the faces became familiar, their stories part of my own understanding of elder abuse. I learned that what my children had attempted was part of a growing epidemic, that family members were the most common perpetrators of financial crimes against the elderly. I learned that shame was a weapon abusers counted on, that isolation made victims vulnerable. I learned that speaking the truth, refusing to protect the guilty, was an act of self-preservation, not vindictiveness. Sir. Chapter 6. The Preliminary Hearing. Summer arrived in Philadelphia with its characteristic oppression, turning the city into a humid pressure cooker. My apartment's old air conditioning unit wheezed gamely against the heat, providing just enough relief to be tolerable. I spent those weeks preparing for the preliminary hearing, meeting with prosecutors, going over my testimony. The assistant district attorney assigned to the case was a woman named Rita Kaminsky, sharp and efficient in her late 30s. She explained what would happen at the hearing. The prosecution would present enough evidence to establish probable cause that crimes had been committed. The defense would try to poke holes in that evidence, though at this stage they rarely succeeded. "This isn't the trial," Rita reminded me during our preparation sessions. "We don't have to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt yet. We just have to show the judge there's enough evidence to proceed. Given what we had, recordings, documents, email chains, bank records, she was confident we'd clear that bar easily." The hearing was scheduled for mid-June on a Tuesday that promised temperatures in the high 90s. I dressed carefully that morning, choosing a simple blue dress and the pearl earrings Thomas had given me for our 10th anniversary. I wanted to look dignified, competent, nothing like the confused, declining woman my children had tried to portray. The courtroom was the same one where the arraignment had taken place, presided over again by Judge Kowalski. This time the gallery had more people, reporters from local news outlets, curious observers who followed criminal proceedings, and sitting in the back corner, Patricia with Garrett's 2 sons. My former daughter-in-law had made good on her promise. She'd brought the boys to see their grandmother. They waved tentatively at me, and I managed a small smile in return before taking my seat. My children looked worse than they had at the arraignment. Garrett had lost weight, his expensive suit hanging slightly loose on his frame. Lenora's hair needed touching up, gray roots showing, her makeup unable to fully conceal the dark circles under her eyes. Maxwell appeared to have aged 5 years and 3 months, his shoulders hunched, his entire demeanor defeated. Good. Let them feel a fraction of what they'd put me through. The hearing began with Christine Yardley from the bank. She testified about the fraud attempts, the forged signatures, the inconsistencies that had triggered the investigation. She was professional and thorough, presenting the documentation clearly. The defense attorneys cross-examined her, but couldn't shake her testimony. The facts were what they were. Then Detective Howell took the stand, walking through the investigation, the email chains, the coordination between the defendants, the elaborate scheme they'd constructed. He presented timeline charts, phone records, bank statements. The evidence was damning and thorough. When Rita called me to the stand, I felt my heart rate accelerate. But I'd spent 40 years working in a factory where mistakes could cost you a finger or worse. You learn to stay focused under pressure. Rita led me through the basic facts of my life. Widow for 31 years. 3 children I'd raised alone. 40 years at the textile factory before retirement. My savings, earned through decades of labor, meant to support my final years. Then she asked me to describe what happened when Christine Yardley called me that February morning. I told the story clearly, without excessive emotion, just the facts, the call, the bank meeting, the recordings, the realization that my own children were trying to steal from me. "How did it make you feel?" Rita asked, "to learn that your children had attempted this?" "Objection," Garrett's lawyer said immediately. "Her feelings aren't relevant to establishing probable cause." "Your Honor," Rita responded, "the psychological impact goes to the nature of the crime, particularly the enhancement for exploitation of an elderly victim." Judge Kowalski thought for a moment. "I'll allow it. The witness may answer. I looked at Rita, then at the judge, then finally at my 3 children sitting at the defense table, staring at anything but me. It felt like death, I said quietly. Not my death, but the death of who I believed them to be, the death of the family I thought we had. I'd spent 31 years raising them alone, sacrificing everything I had, and they repaid that by trying to render me homeless and destitute. So yes, it hurt. It still hurts. But that doesn't change what they did, or the fact that they need to answer for it. Garrett's lawyer cross-examined me, trying to make it seem like I was vindictive, that I was overreacting to what he called an unfortunate misunderstanding between family members. I kept my composure, answering his questions directly. Isn't it true, Ms. Calloway, that your children were genuinely concerned about your welfare? No, I said flatly. If they were concerned about my welfare, they would have talked to me, not forged my signature and tried to steal $300,000. Your Honor, the lawyer started. Move on, counselor, Judge Kowalski said dryly. Lenora's lawyer tried a different tack, suggesting I was experiencing memory problems, that I was confused about their intentions. But Rita's redirect demolished that theory by having me recite, from memory, specific details from the bank documents, the dates of the fraud attempts, the amounts involved. My mind was sharp, and everyone in that courtroom knew it. Maxwell's public defender asked me if I'd consider a settlement, a way to resolve this, within the family, without criminal prosecution. I'd been warned this might come up. My children stole from me, I said, or tried to. That's not a family matter. That's a crime, and crimes have consequences. The hearing lasted 3 hours. When it concluded, Judge Kowalski barely deliberated. Based on the evidence presented, the court finds sufficient probable cause to bind all 3 defendants over for trial. The charges will proceed. Defendants will continue under the conditions previously set. We'll schedule a trial date for... She consulted with the court clerk. October 15th. This court is adjourned. Her gavel came down. It was done. We were going to trial. I stood, my legs slightly unsteady, and made my way out of the courtroom. Patricia and the boys met me in the hallway. We stood there awkwardly for a moment. These children I'd watched grow up but rarely saw, separated now by their father's crimes. Grandma, the older boy, 14-year-old Colin, said hesitantly, "Are you okay?" I looked at him, this young man who looked so much like his father, and felt my heart crack a little further. He was innocent in all this. They both were. "I'm surviving," I told him honestly. "That's about all I can manage right now." Patricia invited me to lunch. I declined, not ready for that level of reconciliation yet, but I took her number and promised to call. Maybe someday I could have a relationship with these boys that existed independently of their father. Maybe... Detective Howell walked me out of the courthouse. The June heat hit us like a physical wall. Philadelphia stretched out around us, indifferent to my small drama. "You did good in there," he said. "Stayed steady." "Factory training," I replied. "You learn not to flinch." He smiled slightly. "Most people in your situation drop the charges before it gets this far. Family pressure, guilt, hope they'll change. You haven't wavered." "Should I have?" I asked. "No," he said firmly. "They committed serious crimes. But most victims struggle with the reality that seeking justice means watching family members face prison. You're handling it better than most." I thought about that as I rode the bus home. Was I handling it well? Or was I simply too broken inside to feel the full weight of what was happening? The grief would hit at unexpected moments. Seeing a mother and daughter shopping together, hearing a child call grandma in the supermarket, watching families gather in the park on Sundays. But whatever I was feeling, whatever the cost, I knew I was doing the right thing. Because the alternative, letting them get away with it, teaching them that they could abuse the people who loved them without consequences, was unacceptable. If this was what strength looked like, it felt nothing like I'd imagined. It didn't feel noble or empowering. It felt lonely and sad and necessary. But necessary was enough. It had to be. Torfurtham. Chapter 7. The Summer of Waiting. The months between the preliminary hearing and the trial stretched out like taffy, each day long and sticky with anxiety. Philadelphia's summer dragged on, humid and relentless, the kind of heat that made you understand why people used to flee to the shore for entire seasons. I developed a new routine to fill the endless days. Mornings I spent at the library on Vine Street, reading newspapers and working through puzzle books. The cool air and quiet anonymity were comforting. The librarians learned my face, offered me recommendations, never asked questions about why I was there so often. Afternoons I walked, miles through Philadelphia's neighborhoods, forcing my aging body to stay strong, to remain capable. I walked through Rittenhouse Square, past the upscale shops where I'd never been able to afford to shop, through South Street with its eclectic energy, down to Penn's Landing to watch the Delaware River flow past, indifferent and eternal. I attended the support group every Thursday evening. The familiar faces became a kind of surrogate family, united by our shared experience of betrayal. We celebrated small victories together. Eleanor got her medications back through insurance reimbursement. Walter's daughter was sentenced to 2 years probation. Ruth found a new apartment and was slowly rebuilding her independence. And we mourned our losses, not just the financial theft, but the innocence we'd lost, the belief that family meant safety. Some people in the group had reconciled with their abusers, choosing forgiveness over justice. I didn't judge them for that choice. Everyone had to find their own path through the wreckage. But my path was different. I wasn't built for capitulation, for accepting abuse in the name of family harmony. Maybe that made me harder than I should be. Or maybe it just made me honest about what had happened and what I deserved. Basic human dignity, especially from, my own children. In July, Patricia invited me to Colin's birthday party. It was a small gathering at her apartment in Chestnut Hill, a neighborhood I'd only driven through but never lived in. The home was beautiful, tastefully decorated, filled with the kind of furniture that came from actual stores rather than thrift shops or factory discounts. Garrett wasn't there, obviously. The divorce was proceeding, Patricia explained. He'd moved into a rental in Center City. The boys saw him on supervised visits, a requirement of his bail conditions given the nature of his charges. I felt awkward at the party, surrounded by Patricia's friends and family who knew the situation, but didn't quite know how to act around me. Was I the victim? The vindictive ex-mother-in-law? Both. Neither. But Colin seemed genuinely happy I'd come. He showed me his birthday gifts, talked about high school starting in the fall, shared his worries about his father. The younger boy, 10-year-old Marcus, was more reserved, clearly confused about everything happening to his family. "Dad says you're angry at him," Marcus told me quietly, while Colin was opening presents. "He says you don't understand what he was trying to do." I looked at this child, innocent and hurting, and tried to find words that were honest without being cruel. "Your dad made some very bad choices," I said carefully. "Adult choices that hurt people. I'm not angry, Marcus. I'm disappointed, and I'm protecting myself. Those can both be true at the same time." He nodded, not really understanding but accepting that this was the best answer he'd get. I left the party early, taking the bus back to my apartment as the July sun began its descent. I felt drained but also strangely lighter. I could have a relationship with my grandchildren. It wouldn't be the traditional, cozy grandmother relationship I'd imagined, but it could exist independently of what their father had done. August brought a surprise. A letter from Maxwell. It was addressed to my old phone number, which I'd never given out in my new life, meaning he must have gotten it from someone. The letter was 3 pages, handwritten, his penmanship as messy as it had been when he was a child struggling with schoolwork. He was sorry, he wrote. So desperately sorry. He'd been weak, had let Garrett convince him this was okay, had been scared of disappointing his older brother who'd always been more successful. He knew what they'd tried to do was wrong. He knew he'd destroyed our relationship. But he wanted me to know he was genuinely remorseful. He wasn't asking me to drop the charges. He understood why I couldn't do that. He just wanted me to know he was sorry, that he thought about what he'd done every day, that he'd started seeing a therapist to understand how he could have betrayed the person who'd loved him most. I read the letter 3 times, looking for manipulation, for some angle he was working. But it seemed genuine in its brokenness. Maxwell had always been the weak one, the follower, the child who needed someone to tell him what to do. That didn't excuse what he'd done, but it explained it in a way that felt true. I didn't respond to the letter. I wasn't ready for that, but I kept it, tucked it into the journal I was maintaining. Acknowledgement that even in the midst of betrayal, human beings were complicated. Maxwell's remorse didn't undo his crime, but it was something, a small something. Lenora, by contrast, had doubled down on her victim narrative. According to Patricia, who'd kept in loose contact with her, Lenora was telling everyone who'd listened that I was overreacting, that she'd only been trying to help, that I'd always favored the boys over her anyway. She'd created an elaborate story about my supposed mental decline, convincing herself and anyone who'd believe her that she was the real victim in all this. The psychology of it fascinated me, in a distant, analytical way. How did someone so thoroughly deny reality? How did she square her lies with the actual evidence? Recordings of her voice, emails in her words, her handwriting on forged documents. But denial, I was learning, was a powerful force. People could convince themselves of almost anything if the truth was too painful to accept. Garrett remained silent. No letters, no attempts to reach out. He was strategic, calculating his moves through lawyers and legal procedures. Of the three, he was the most dangerous because he was the smartest. He understood exactly what he'd done and had simply been willing to do it anyway. In late August, I received notification that the trial date had been moved. Court scheduling conflicts pushed it back to November. 2 more months of waiting, of existing in this liminal space between old life and new. Rita called to apologize for the delay, explaining that this was common in the criminal justice system. I told her it was fine, which was partly true. Part of me wanted it over with, wanted to reach whatever resolution was waiting on the other side of the trial. But part of me knew that the trial itself wouldn't bring closure. There was no real closure available for this kind of wound. September arrived with cooler temperatures and the stirrings of fall. The Philadelphia I walked through began its annual transformation, leaves starting to turn, the light taking on that particular autumn quality that always made me melancholic. I turned 74 that month. I'd imagined this birthday surrounded by family, by grandchildren and cake and the comfortable chaos of people who loved each other. Instead, I celebrated quietly with Iris from the support group. We had dinner at a small Italian restaurant in South Philly, talking about everything except the upcoming trial. As we were leaving, Iris put her hand on my arm. "You know," she said, "you're going to survive this. Not just survive, you're going to be okay, eventually. It won't feel like it for a long time, but you're strong enough to make it through." "How do you know?" I asked. "Because you're still standing," she said simply. "After everything they tried to do to you, you're still standing. That's not nothing, Deirdre. That's everything." Chapter 8. The Trial Begins. November came to Philadelphia with slate-gray skies and biting wind. The trial began on a Monday morning that felt more like deep winter than early fall. I dressed in my best outfit, a gray suit I'd bought at Macy's 15 years ago for my retirement party, paired with a simple white blouse. Rita had advised me to look respectable but not wealthy. To remind the jury I was a working-class woman whose savings represented decades of factory labor. The courthouse hallways smelled of floor wax and anxiety. I could see other people preparing for their own trials, their own moments of reckoning with the justice system. We were all strangers brought together by crime and circumstance, waiting for 12 other strangers to decide our fates. Jury selection had taken 3 days the previous week. Rita had explained her strategy. They wanted people who understood hard work, who had elderly parents they cared about, who would see my children's actions as the profound betrayal they were. The defense wanted, well, I wasn't entirely sure what the defense wanted, but they'd use their challenges to eliminate anyone who worked in banking or elder care. The final jury was a mix. 7 women, 5 men, ages ranging from early 30s to late 60s. 2 of the women were black. 1 man was Asian American. The rest appeared to be white. They filed into the jury box looking nervous and determined. Ordinary people thrust into an extraordinary situation. Judge Kowalski called the court to order. The same stern presence from the earlier hearings, she ran her courtroom with efficient discipline. She explained the charges to the jury, outlined what they'd be hearing, reminded them of their duty to be impartial. Then Rita began her opening statement. She painted a clear picture. A widow who'd worked for 40 years, raised 3 children alone, saved every penny she could. 3 middle-aged children who decided they couldn't wait for their inheritance. A conspiracy spanning months, involving forged documents, fabricated medical crises, attempts to have their mother declared incompetent and institutionalized, and most damning, the recordings and documents proving every element of their scheme. "This isn't a case about a family disagreement," Rita told the jury. This is a case about 3 people who saw their elderly mother not as a human being deserving of dignity, but as an ATM they were entitled to access. The evidence will show you exactly what they tried to do, in their own words, in their own handwriting, in their own voices. And the evidence will show you that they only stopped because they got caught. Garrett's lawyer went first for the defense. He was smooth, articulate, painting a picture of concerned children worried about their aging mother's welfare. Yes, they'd made mistakes in how they approached the situation, he admitted. Yes, they should have been more transparent. But criminal fraud, that was a mischaracterization of genuine concern, he argued. It was masterful lawyering and completely dishonest. Lenora's lawyer tried the emotional angle. His client was a devoted daughter, he insisted, who'd only wanted to protect her mother from bad financial decisions. She'd gotten caught up in her brother's plan, had meant no harm, had been acting out of love, also dishonest, but less smoothly delivered. Maxwell's public defender had the hardest job. He basically admitted his client's participation, but argued Maxwell had been manipulated by his more sophisticated siblings, that he was guilty of poor judgment rather than criminal intent. At least that had elements of truth to it. The first week of trial was dominated by evidence presentation. Christine from the bank testified again, now for the jury rather than just the judge. The forged signatures appeared on screens throughout the courtroom. My real signature shone alongside the fakes. Even I could see the differences now that they'd been pointed out. The way the forged versions pressed too hard on certain strokes, the slight tremor in others. Someone had practiced those signatures for hours. The thought made me cold. Detective Howell walked the jury through the investigation, presenting email chains that showed clear coordination. They read selected emails aloud in the courtroom, my children's words filling the space. Garrett writing, "We need to move quickly before she spends more. Her expenses have increased, and at this rate there won't be much left. I'd increased my spending by buying a new winter coat. $43 at Kohl's." Lenora responding, "I've contacted 3 facilities. The one in Bala Sinwid has availability and accepts conservatorship placements. We need to move by end of month." Discussing where to institutionalize me, as if I were a piece of furniture they needed to store. Maxwell writing, "Are we sure about this? Feels wrong." At least he'd had some hesitation. Garrett's response, "She's 73 and in declining health. This is protective, not punitive. We're ensuring her care and preserving family assets. Don't get cold feet now. I was not in declining health. My diabetes was controlled. My blood pressure was managed. I walked 3 miles most days." But the lies flowed easily from Garrett's keyboard. The jury listened to all of this with increasingly appalled expressions. I watched their faces, saw the exact moment each one realized the full scope of what my children had attempted. A middle-aged black woman in the front row actually shook her head in disgust during one email exchange. Then came the recordings. The courtroom fell silent as my children's voices filled the space, each one lying to bank representatives about my supposed condition, my supposed needs. Hearing them again, months after that first time in Christine's office, didn't lessen the impact. If anything, it was worse surrounded by strangers hearing my own children try to rob me. When Garrett's recording played, I watched him at the defense table. He sat perfectly still, his lawyer's training helping him maintain composure, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw clenched. Lenora cried during her recording, as if hearing her own lies somehow made her the victim. Her lawyer passed her tissues, playing up her distress for the jury, but I noticed several jurors weren't buying it. The middle-aged black woman actually rolled her eyes. Maxwell stared at his hands during his recording, unable to watch the jury watching him. The prosecution finished their case-in-chief after a week of testimony. They'd presented overwhelming evidence: documents, recordings, emails, bank records, testimony from multiple witnesses. They'd built a case so thorough that any reasonable person would have to conclude my children had attempted exactly what they were charged with. Now it was the defense's turn, and I was dreading it, because I knew what was coming. They were going to attack me. Tuck the Chapter 9, the defense. The defense strategy became clear within the first hour of their case. They were going to argue I was, in fact, experiencing cognitive decline, and that my perception of events was unreliable. The evidence might look bad, they suggested, but context would show concerned children trying to help a mother who didn't understand her own best interests. It was brazen and predictable. Garrett's lawyer called their first witness, Dr. Edmund Rothschild, a geriatric psychiatrist who'd examined exactly 0 minutes of my medical history, but was prepared to testify as an expert on elder cognition. He explained to the jury how common it was for elderly people to experience paranoia, to misinterpret helpful actions as hostile, to resist care they desperately needed. Rita's cross-examination was surgical. Dr. Rothschild, have you ever met Ms. Calloway? No, but I've reviewed... So you've never examined her, spoken with her, reviewed her actual medical records, or conducted any cognitive assessment? I've reviewed the defense's summary of... Doctor, yes or no, have you personally evaluated Deirdre Calloway's cognitive function? No. No further questions. The defense called Garrett's paralegal next, a young woman who testified that Garrett had been very concerned about me, had spoken frequently about my welfare. But under Rita's cross-examination, it emerged that these conversations were always about my finances, never about my actual health or well-being. Did Mr. Calloway ever discuss taking his mother to a doctor's appointment? Rita asked. No. Did he ever mention visiting her to check on her condition? Not that I recall. Did he ever bring her to family gatherings or holidays at his home? I don't know. But he frequently discussed her bank accounts. Objection! Garrett's lawyer shouted. Sustained. Counsel, rephrase. Did Mr. Calloway discuss his mother's financial assets in your presence? Yes. How often? Weekly, at least. Rita let that hang in the air before moving on. Lenora's defense called her therapist, a woman who testified that Lenora had indeed been worried about me, had discussed in their sessions her concerns about my increasing confusion. But Rita got the therapist to admit that all of this information came from Lenora herself, that the therapist had no independent knowledge of my condition, and that Lenora had only started these therapy sessions 3 weeks before the fraud attempts began. Isn't it true, Rita asked, that therapy records could be useful in establishing a defense to criminal charges? Objection. Withdrawn. No further questions. Maxwell's public defender tried a different approach, calling Maxwell's wife to testify about financial pressures their family was facing. They had 3 children. Mounting debts, my wife explained tearfully. Maxwell had been desperate, had made terrible choices under pressure from his siblings. It was probably the most honest testimony the defense offered. Then came the moment I'd been dreading. They called me to the stand. As a defendant has the right to present their case, they could call witnesses, and technically, I was a witness to events, even though I was the victim. Garrett's lawyer handled the cross-examination. He was gentle at first, asking about my age, my medical history, my daily routine. Then the questions became more pointed. Ms. Calloway, isn't it true you sometimes forget where you've placed items in your apartment? Everyone does occasionally. Isn't it true you've sometimes forgotten appointments? I've rescheduled appointments when something more important came up. That's not forgetting, that's prioritizing. Isn't it true you sometimes have difficulty with modern technology? I'm 74 years old. The technology was invented after I retired, but I manage fine. Manage fine? You needed help setting up your email account, didn't you? 15 years ago, yes. I'm quite competent with it now. He tried to paint a picture of declining capacity, but I refused to cooperate. For every suggestion of confusion, I had a clear, specific response. I cited dates, remembered details, demonstrated that my mind was sharp even if my body was aging. Finally, he tried the direct approach. Ms. Calloway, isn't it possible your children were genuinely trying to help you? No. You don't think it's possible? I know it's not possible because I heard the recordings. I saw the forged signatures. I read the emails where they discussed how to get around my decision-making authority. Those aren't the actions of people trying to help. Those are the actions of people trying to steal. Ms. Calloway, your children love you. If that's what love looks like, I said, my voice hard, I'll take being hated. The courtroom was utterly silent. No further questions, Garrett's lawyer said, sitting down heavily. Rita's redirect was brief. She simply asked me to explain, in my own words, how the discovery had affected me. It destroyed my family, I said simply. It destroyed my faith in the people I loved most. It taught me that the sacrifices I made for 31 years meant nothing to them, that they saw me only as an obstacle to money. I'd rather be poor and loved than wealthy. and viewed as a living ATM, but I wasn't given that choice. They tried to take everything from me and pretend it was for my own good. That's not love. That's not help. That's cruelty wrapped in concern. Several jurors were nodding. The defense rested their case. Neither Garrett, Lenora, nor Maxwell testified on their own behalf. Their lawyers had wisely decided that putting them on the stand would only give Rita the opportunity to destroy them under cross-examination. Closing arguments came the following day. Rita was powerful, walking the jury through the evidence piece by piece, showing how it all connected into an undeniable pattern of conspiracy and fraud. "The defendants want you to believe this was concern," she told the jury. "But concerned children don't forge signatures. They don't create fake medical documentation. They don't coordinate through encrypted emails to avoid detection. Concerned children talk to their parent. They offer help. They respect autonomy. The defendants did none of these things because they weren't concerned about Deirdre Calloway's welfare. They were concerned about Deirdre Calloway's bank balance." The defense lawyers gave their closings, still trying to spin concern out of conspiracy. But the evidence was too strong, and they knew it. Their arguments rang hollow. Judge Kowalski instructed the jury on the law, explaining reasonable doubt, burden of proof, the specific elements of each charge. Then she sent them out to deliberate. The waiting was agony. I sat in the courthouse hallway with Rita and Detective Howell, drinking terrible coffee from vending machines, trying not to obsess over every possible outcome. Juries were unpredictable. Even with overwhelming evidence, you never knew what 12 people might decide. They could buy the defense's narrative. They could think I was overreacting. They could nullify based on sympathy for the defendants, families. 4 hours passed, then 6. The courthouse emptied of other cases, other dramas. Only hours remained, waiting for resolution. At 7:30 p.m., the jury sent a note to the judge. They had reached verdicts. We filed back into the courtroom. My legs barely supported me. This was it, the moment that would define what justice meant for what my children had tried to do. The jury filed in, their faces carefully neutral. Judge Kowalski asked if they'd reached verdicts on all charges for all defendants. The forewoman, the middle-aged black woman who'd been in the front row throughout the trial, stood and confirmed they had. As to the defendant, Garrett Calloway, on the charge of conspiracy to commit fraud, how do you find? Guilty. On the charge of forgery, guilty. One by one, guilty verdicts for every charge. Then Lenora, guilty on all counts. Then Maxwell, guilty on all counts. My children sat frozen at the defense table. Lenora was crying. Maxwell looked like he might be sick. Garrett stared straight ahead, his face a mask. Judge Kowalski set a sentencing date for 6 weeks out. She thanked the jury for their service and dismissed them. It was over. They'd been convicted. Justice, at least in its legal form, had been served. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt hollow.